3 minutes. That's all it took to destroy a badge that took 10 years to earn. The sharp metallic click echoed louder than it should have, cutting through the controlled chaos of Terminal B like a gunshot no one fired. And for a split second, everything slowed. The rolling suitcases, the overhead announcements, even the distant hum of jet engines outside the glass walls stretching across the runway. Because right there, in the middle of Gate 47, a woman stood still with her hands secured behind her back, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, while Officer Daniel Brooks tightened his grip just enough to make a point without saying another word, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning her like she didn't belong in a place like this, like the tailored navy blazer she wore was some kind of disguise instead of a statement, like the calm in her breathing was something suspicious rather than controlled. And if you had been standing there, watching from just a few feet away, you would have felt it too, that quiet shift in the air, that uncomfortable tension. When power is used just a little too easily, just a little too confidently, and no one steps in to question it. Not yet. Not here. Not in a place where authority wears a uniform and people are taught to trust it without hesitation. Because this was an airport, a place where rules were absolute and hesitation could get you flagged, questioned, delayed, or worse. And Naomi Carter knew that better than anyone, which was exactly why she didn't resist, not when the officer told her to turn around. Not when he said she matched a description, not even when the cold steel closed around her wrists, because her silence wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, and it definitely wasn't guilt. It was timing, precise, calculated timing, the kind that comes from years of knowing when to speak and when to let the moment unfold exactly as it needs to. And still, to everyone watching, she looked like just another traveler who had done something wrong, another headline waiting to happen, another quiet example of how quickly things could shift when assumptions took the lead. Phones slowly began to rise, subtle at first, then more obvious, lenses pointed in her direction as whispers started to ripple through the crowd. What did she do? Did they find something? She doesn't look dangerous, but Brooks didn't care about any of that. He had already made his decision the moment he stepped in front of her, already convinced himself he was doing exactly what he was trained to do, maintaining order, enforcing control, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks, and maybe, just maybe, proving something to himself along the way, because the way he stood there, shoulders squared, voice firm, eyes locked on her like he had already solved the case, it wasn't just procedure, it was belief, the kind that doesn't ask questions, the kind that doesn't wait for answers. And Naomi felt it, not as anger, not as fear, but as something colder, something more familiar, like a pattern she had seen play out too many times before, except this time. The ending was already written, he just didn't know it yet. The terminal did not return to normal after the handcuffs clicked. It only pretended to, because beneath the steady rhythm of boarding calls and rolling luggage there was a tension that refused to settle, a subtle awareness that something about this moment was not finished, and Naomi Carter could feel it in the way the air shifted around her, in the way people kept looking just a second too long before glancing away, in the way Officer Brooks adjusted his stance like he was waiting for her to crack, to explain, to apologize, to give him something that would confirm the story he had already built in his mind. But she did not give him anything, not a word, not a reaction, only silence, controlled and deliberate, the kind of silence that does not come from uncertainty, but from discipline. And if you listen closely, you could almost hear the difference, because her breathing never changed, her shoulders never dropped, and even with her hands secured behind her back, she stood as if she still had full control of the space around her, which only made Brooks more certain that something was off. Because in his experience people either protested loudly or broke down quietly. They did not stand still like this. They did not look at him with calm eyes that carried no panic, no urgency, no fear, and that calm began to irritate him in a way he could not quite explain. So he stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal, asking where she was headed, what she was doing in this terminal, why her name had not come up clean fast enough in his system. Questions that sounded routine, but carried an edge of accusation, and still, Naomi did not rush to answer. She simply turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze, and for a brief moment the noise of the terminal seemed to fade, because there was something in that look, something steady and unshaken, like she was not the one being evaluated, like she was the one observing him, measuring him. And that feeling, that subtle reversal, was enough to make him tighten his jaw again as he signaled to another officer nearby, a younger man who hesitated for just a second before stepping in, glancing between Brooks and Naomi as if trying to understand what exactly had escalated this far. Because from where he stood, nothing about her matched the urgency of the situation. Her carry-on bag sat neatly by her feet. Her identification had already been handed over without resistance, and there had been no attempt to leave, no raised voice, no sudden movement, just compliance, quiet and complete, which made the scene feel heavier than it should have, like a story missing a key detail. And that was when Naomi's eyes shifted, not toward Brooks, but past him, toward the far end of the terminal where a man in a gray jacket stood near a column, watching, not openly, not obviously, but enough for someone trained to notice. And for the first time, a subtle change crossed her expression, not fear, not frustration, but calculation, precise and immediate, because timing was no longer just important, it was critical, and yet she still said nothing, still allowed the moment to stretch, because sometimes the fastest way to control a situation is to let it unfold just a little longer, just enough for the truth to arrive on its own, and somewhere behind the growing crowd, beyond the line of sight of the officer who believed he was in control, something had already begun to move. The movement began so quietly that no one noticed it at first, not the passengers clutching their boarding passes, not the agents scanning tickets at the gate, and certainly not Officer Brooks, who was too focused on maintaining control over the situation he believed he had already solved, because in his mind this was simple, a routine stop, a suspicious traveler, a quick resolution, and yet nothing about the woman in front of him behaved the way his experience told him it should, and that contradiction was starting to press against his confidence like a crack forming beneath the surface, subtle but growing, because Naomi Carter had not once asked why she was being detained, had not raised her voice, had not even attempted to assert herself in the way most people would when placed in her position, and that absence of reaction, that refusal to follow the expected script, was beginning to feel less like compliance and more like control, as if she understood something about this moment that he did not. And that feeling only sharpened when the younger officer beside him shifted his weight again, glancing toward the far end of the terminal where a small group of individuals had just stepped through a restricted access door, their pace steady, their expressions focused, not hurried but purposeful, the kind of movement that does not draw attention unless you know what to look for. And Naomi knew exactly what she was looking for, her eyes locking onto them for half a second before returning forward, her breathing unchanged, but inside, everything had aligned, every second, every delay, every decision that had led to this point was now converging, because the man in the gray jacket had moved, just slightly, just enough to reposition himself, closer to the exit corridor, thinking no one had noticed, thinking the disruption unfolding a few yards away had created the perfect cover, and for anyone else, it might have, but not for her, not today, and certainly not after the weeks she had spent tracking patterns, memorizing routines, building a case that depended on precision, not chaos, which made what was happening now both frustrating and inevitable. Because interference like this was always a possibility, always a risk, and the only way to survive it was to adapt without revealing the entire picture too soon. And that was why she remained silent, even now, even as Brooks reached for her identification again, flipping it over like he expected to find something he had missed, something that would justify the unease creeping into his thoughts. But the card told him nothing more than what he already knew, a name, a photo, a standard issue detail that fit neatly into his assumptions. And so he doubled down, asking again, sharper this time, who she was, what she was doing, why she had been watching the terminal so closely, questions layered with suspicion instead of curiosity. And for the first time, Naomi responded, not loudly, not defensively, but with a calm that cut through the noise around them, her voice steady, measured, almost quiet enough to be missed if you were not paying attention. She said, "You are asking the wrong questions." And that sentence, simple as it was, landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it did not challenge his authority directly, it did not accuse, it did not explain, it redirected, and in doing so it introduced doubt, just enough to make him hesitate, just enough to make the younger officer beside him look again toward the approaching group, whose presence was no longer subtle, whose movement now carried a weight that began to ripple through the space, drawing attention not through noise but through certainty. And as they closed the distance, as the air seemed to tighten with something unseen but undeniable, the moment that had started with control was quietly slipping into something else entirely, something Brooks could not yet define, but would soon understand all too clearly. By the time the group reached the edge of the crowd, the atmosphere had already shifted in a way that no announcement could explain. Conversations lowered, movement slowed, and even the rolling wheels of suitcases seemed quieter against the polished floor, as if the entire terminal instinctively understood that something significant was about to unfold, and Officer Brooks felt it too, though he could not yet name it. That subtle pressure in the air that made him straighten his posture just a little more, tighten his grip on procedure, because when uncertainty appears, authority often responds by doubling down. And so he spoke again, louder this time, reinforcing control, stating that the situation was under investigation, that no one needed to interfere, that everything was being handled. But the words did not land the way they had moments before, because now there were eyes not just watching, but assessing. And the individuals approaching did not hesitate, did not slow, did not ask for permission to enter the space he believed he controlled. They moved with quiet certainty, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. And Naomi Carter saw them clearly now, each step aligning with the timing she had calculated from the very beginning, each second confirming that the operation had not fallen apart, only changed shape. And that realization settled over her like calm after tension, not relief, but readiness, because what came next would not be loud. It would not be chaotic. It would be precise, and precision does not rush. It arrives exactly when it is meant to. And as the lead agent stepped forward, his presence alone was enough to shift the balance in the space, not through force, not through volume, but through authority that did not need to be proven twice. His eyes moved from Brooks to Naomi, then briefly to the surrounding officers, taking in the entire scene in a matter of seconds. And when he spoke, his voice was level, controlled, and unmistakably clear, asking a simple question that carried more weight than any command. Who authorized this detention? And for the first time since the encounter began, Brooks did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because something in the way the question was asked made him realize that the answer might not be enough, that the situation was no longer as straightforward as he had believed, and that hesitation, brief as it was all the confirmation the lead agent needed before his attention shifted fully to Naomi, his tone softening. Just slightly, not out of sympathy, but out of recognition. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without making a scene, Naomi spoke, just a few words, calm and direct, identifying herself in a way that did not require explanation. Federal Marshal Naomi Carter, and the effect was immediate, not explosive, not dramatic, but absolute, like a switch being flipped that changed the entire structure of the moment, because suddenly everything that had seemed certain just seconds ago no longer held. The assumptions, the control, the narrative Brooks had built, all of it unraveled in the quiet space between those words and the silence that followed, and you could see it in the faces around them. The realization spreading not through sound, but through understanding, the younger officer stepping back instinctively, the crowd growing still, the subtle shift of power that does not need to be announced because it is felt by everyone at once. And Brooks stood there, the weight of what had just been revealed settling over him in a way no training had prepared him for, because this was not just a mistake, it was a moment, a turning point, the exact kind that defines careers, that lingers long after the situation ends. And Naomi, now no longer just a traveler in the wrong place at the wrong time, but exactly who she had always been, remained composed, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, because for her, this was not the climax, it was simply the next step. And somewhere beyond the edge of the crowd, the man in the gray jacket had just realized the same thing, that the moment he thought would protect him had just done the opposite, and that the woman he had underestimated was never the distraction. She was the reason everything was about to change. The silence that followed her words did not break all at once. It stretched, heavy and deliberate, like the entire terminal was holding its breath, waiting to see who would move first. And for a moment, No one did. Not Officer Brooks. Not the younger officer beside him. Not even the crowd that had gathered just far enough to watch without stepping in. Because what had just shifted was not just authority, it was certainty. And certainty, once broken, does not recover quickly, it fractures, it hesitates, it forces every decision that follows to carry weight. And Brooks felt that weight immediately, pressing against the confidence he had been standing on just seconds ago, because now every action he had taken was being reevaluated in real time, not just by the agents who had arrived, but by himself. And that is where doubt becomes something more dangerous than error. It becomes awareness. The kind that arrives too late to prevent the mistake, but just in time to understand it. And as the lead agent stepped closer, his attention no longer divided, his focus now entirely on Naomi. There was no urgency in his movements, no raised voice, just a calm efficiency that made everything else in the scene feel smaller, less controlled, less certain, and with a slight nod, almost imperceptible, he signaled to one of the agents behind him, and within seconds, the handcuffs that had defined the moment were removed, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just quietly, like they should have never been there in the first place. And Naomi brought her hands forward slowly, not rubbing her wrists, not reacting, just adjusting her posture by a fraction, as if resetting herself back into alignment with the situation she had never truly lost control of. And when she looked at Brooks again, there was no anger in her expression, no need for it. Only clarity, the kind that does not accuse but does not forget. And that clarity was far more unsettling than any confrontation could have been, because it left him standing in a moment where there was nothing to defend, nothing to argue, only the undeniable reality of what had just occurred. And around them, the subtle shift continued, the crowd no longer whispering with curiosity, but watching with understanding, the younger officer stepping back another inch, creating space where there had once been support. And in that space, Brooks found himself alone, not physically, but professionally, because authority without certainty isolates faster than any distance ever could. And then Naomi spoke again, her voice steady, not raised, not sharp, but direct in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. She said, "You interrupted an active federal operation," and those words did not land like a threat, they landed like a fact. The kind that does not escalate a situation but reframes it entirely, because now the question was no longer what she had done, but what he had caused. And as if to confirm it, one of the agents stepped forward, quietly informing the lead that the individual in the gray jacket had changed direction, moving toward a restricted exit corridor, the exact scenario Naomi had anticipated, the exact risk she had been managing when she chose not to resist earlier. And in that moment, the final piece fell into place. Because this was never about her detention, it was about timing, about positioning, about allowing the right moment to reveal the right truth. And Brooks, standing there with the realization settling deeper with every passing second, understood something he had not considered before. That control is not about who acts first. It is about who understands the situation fully. And he had not even close. And as the agents began to move, coordinated and precise, the operation continuing despite the disruption, Naomi did not rush to follow immediately. She paused just long enough to let the moment settle, to let the weight of it register, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as consequence. And then, without another word, she stepped forward, leaving behind the space where she had been underestimated, where assumptions had replaced judgment, and where, for a brief but defining moment, the illusion of control had been exposed for exactly what it was. By the time Naomi stepped forward, the energy in the terminal had transformed from confusion into something sharper, more focused, like a lens finally adjusting into clarity, and the agents moved with that same precision, spreading out just enough to cover the exits without drawing unnecessary attention. Because this was no longer about confrontation, it was about containment, about ensuring that the one variable still in motion did not slip through the narrow gaps that chaos tends to create. And Naomi's eyes tracked the path ahead instinctively, calculating distance, timing, and probability all at once. The man in the gray jacket now several yards closer to the restricted corridor, his pace controlled but slightly faster than before, just enough to signal intent without triggering alarm. And that subtle shift was all the confirmation she needed. Because people who believe they are unseen always reveal themselves in motion, not in stillness. And as she passed Brooks, she did not slow down, did not look back immediately, but her voice carried just enough to reach him, calm and even. She said, "Next time, verify before you act," not as a reprimand, not as a warning, but as a statement that would stay with him far longer than anything louder ever could. And then she was already moving past the boundary of the moment that had tried to define her, re-entering the operation as if the interruption had been nothing more than a delay, because in her world, time is not measured in minutes, it is measured in windows, opportunities that open and close without announcement. And this one was still open, but not for long. And ahead, one of the agents gave a subtle signal, 2 fingers slightly raised at waist level, confirming visual on the target, and Naomi adjusted her pace, not faster, not slower, just enough to align with the rhythm of the team, blending into the movement of travelers while remaining exactly where she needed to be, because the best control is the kind no one notices. And as they closed the distance, the man in gray hesitated for a fraction of a second at the entrance to the corridor, glancing over his shoulder just once, a quick, almost instinctive check. And in that glance, everything became clear, the awareness, the calculation, the realization that the situation had shifted against him, but by then, it was already too late for adjustments, because the space around him had quietly changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but strategically, every angle accounted for, every path observed. And Naomi stepped into that space with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, her voice low, controlled, addressing him not with accusation, but with certainty, calling his name just once, enough to stop him without force, enough to bring the moment to a pause that no one else in the terminal fully understood. And as he turned, the operation that had been building beneath the surface for weeks finally surfaced, not in chaos, not in noise, but in quiet completion, the kind that does not need attention because it was never about the crowd. And behind them, far enough to feel distant but close enough to remain real, Officer Brooks still stood where the moment had left him, the weight of it settling deeper as he watched the scene unfold without him, understanding now that what he had interrupted was never his to control, and what he had assumed was never his to define. And in that realization, something shifted, not just in the terminal, but in him, because the line between authority and understanding had just become impossible to ignore. And Naomi, already moving forward again, did not need to look back to know that the lesson had landed exactly where it needed to. The moment he heard his name, everything inside him shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw attention from the passing travelers or the distant gate agents calling final boarding groups, but internally, where instinct meets reality, because being seen is one thing, but being identified with certainty is something else entirely. And the man in the gray jacket understood that difference immediately, his shoulders stiffening just slightly as he turned, his eyes scanning Naomi Carter. With a sharper focus now, no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but calculating, searching for an exit that no longer existed in the way he had planned, because the space around him had closed without noise, without visible force, just presence, positioned with precision. And Naomi stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed but intentional, her gaze steady, giving him exactly one moment to decide how this would end, not through pressure, not through escalation, but through the quiet certainty that resistance would only complicate what had already been resolved. And for a second, just a second, it looked like he might try to shift direction, his foot angling slightly toward the corridor behind him. But the subtle movement of an agent to his left, almost imperceptible, was enough to remove that option without a word. And that was the nature of control when it was done right. It did not block you. It simply left you with nowhere else to go. And Naomi spoke again, her voice low, measured, not accusing, not aggressive, just final. She said, "It is over," and there was something in the way she said it that carried more authority than any raised command ever could, because it was not a prediction, it was a conclusion. And the man exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders not as defeat, but as recognition, because in that moment he understood what he was facing, not just an officer, not just an operation, but someone who had already accounted for every move he could make before he even considered making it. And without another word, without a scene, without drawing Attention from the unaware crowd moving just yards away. The situation resolved itself in the quietest way possible, the agents stepping in with calm coordination, guiding him away from the open flow of the terminal toward a more controlled space. Their movements smooth, deliberate, professional, and Naomi remained where she was for a brief moment longer, watching, not out of suspicion, but out of completion, ensuring that the final piece had settled exactly where it needed to, and only then did she allow herself a small breath, not relief, but acknowledgement, because operations like this are not about endings, they are about precision, about ensuring that every detail aligns even when unexpected variables attempt to interfere. And behind her, the terminal slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, footsteps regained their usual pace, and the moment that had briefly shifted everything began to dissolve back into the background, leaving behind only those who understood what had truly happened, and among them, Officer Brooks still stood, no longer at the center, no longer directing the outcome, but witnessing it from the outside. And as he watched Naomi turn slightly, finally glancing back in his direction, there was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, only a calm recognition that the situation had ended the way it was always meant to. And in that look, brief but undeniable, there was a lesson that did not need to be spoken, because some truths are not taught through words, they are understood through moments like this, moments where authority meets reality and realizes they are not the same thing. And as Naomi turned away once more, stepping back into the flow of the terminal as if she had never been interrupted at all, the echo of that realization remained, quiet but permanent, settling into a space where it would not easily be ignored again. The terminal did not applaud. It did not pause. It did not acknowledge what had just happened beyond a few lingering glances and hushed whispers, because places like this are designed to keep moving no matter what unfolds within them. But for those who had seen, truly seen, there was a quiet understanding that something far more significant than a routine stop had just taken place. And Naomi Carter moved through that space with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning, her steps measured, her focus already shifting forward, because in her world, completion does not invite celebration, it demands transition. And as she approached the edge of the secured area, one of the agents fell into step beside her, offering a brief update in a low voice, confirming that the subject had been transferred without incident, that the data they had been tracking was intact, that the operation, despite the interruption, had held together exactly as intended, and Naomi gave a small nod, not out of satisfaction, but acknowledgement, because success in situations like this is not measured by how clean the process looks, but by whether the outcome aligns with the objective, and this one had, even with variables introduced that could have easily shifted the balance. And behind them, the presence of authority began to dissolve back into anonymity, the agents dispersing, blending into the flow of the terminal just as seamlessly as they had appeared, leaving behind no spectacle, no visible trace of the precision that had just been executed. And that is what made it powerful, not the moment itself, but how easily it disappeared once it was complete, like it had never been there at all. And yet, for Officer Brooks, it remained, anchored in place, because while the world around him resumed its rhythm, his had not. His perspective still caught in the moment where everything he believed about control had been quietly dismantled, and he looked down briefly at his own hands, the same hands that had confidently secured the cuffs just minutes earlier, now empty, not just physically, but symbolically, because what he had held onto so firmly had slipped away without resistance, without force, simply replaced by something stronger, something he had failed to recognize until it was too late. And as he lifted his gaze again, Naomi was already several yards ahead, moving with purpose. No longer the center of attention, no longer the subject of scrutiny, but exactly what she had always been, someone operating with a clarity that does not need validation from those who do not understand it. And for a moment, just a moment, he considered stepping forward, saying something, offering an explanation, an apology, anything that might bridge the gap between what had happened and what he now understood. But the words did not come, not because they were not there, but because he realized they were no longer necessary, because some moments are not meant to be corrected in real time. They are meant to be carried forward, to reshape the decisions that come next. And Naomi, without turning back, without acknowledging the thought that never became action, continued toward the gate where her path would diverge from the terminal's routine once again, her role shifting as seamlessly as her presence had, because for her, this was not the end of a story, it was simply the continuation of one that rarely pauses long enough to be fully seen. And as she disappeared into the flow of travelers, indistinguishable from anyone else to those who had not been paying attention, the only thing left behind was the quiet echo of a moment that had revealed far more than it had shown, a reminder that authority is not proven by how quickly it acts, but by how accurately it understands. And in that space, where assumption had once led and understanding had followed too late, something had changed, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. The final boarding call echoed softly through the terminal, a calm voice layered over the steady rhythm of movement, as if nothing unusual had ever interrupted the flow of this place, as if the moment that had unfolded minutes earlier had already been absorbed into the background like it never existed. And Naomi Carter stepped forward with the rest of the passengers, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, blending seamlessly into the line as she handed over her boarding pass, the agent, scanning it without hesitation, without recognition, because to them, she was just another traveler continuing her journey. And that was exactly how it was meant to be, because the most powerful roles are often the ones no one notices, the ones that operate quietly beneath the surface, ensuring that everything above it continues without disruption. And as she walked down the jet bridge, the noise of the terminal fading behind her, there was no need for reflection, no pause to consider what had just happened, because for her, the lesson had never been personal. It had always been structural, about timing, about awareness, about understanding the difference between reacting to a situation and truly seeing it. And back in the terminal, Officer Brooks remained where the moment had left him. Though everything around him had returned to normal, his reality had not, because once a perspective shifts, it does not simply reset, it lingers, it replays, it forces questions that did not exist before. And as he finally began to move again, stepping away from the space where he had once stood so firmly, there was no urgency in his stride, only a quiet weight that followed him, not as punishment, but as understanding, the kind that does not arrive loudly but stays indefinitely. And in that understanding, he could see it clearly now, not just what had happened, but how easily it had happened, how quickly assumption had replaced observation, how confidently he had acted without fully knowing, and how that confidence had nearly disrupted something far greater than he had imagined. And that realization settled deeper than any reprimand ever could, because it was his, fully and undeniably. And as the terminal continued its endless cycle of arrivals and departures, of strangers crossing paths without ever truly seeing one another, the moment that had briefly connected them all began to fade from memory, except for those who had been changed by it. And Naomi, now seated quietly on the plane, looking out through the small window at the runway stretching into the distance, did not carry the moment with her as something heavy, but as confirmation that even in spaces defined by control, true authority does not need to announce itself. It reveals itself when it matters most. And as the aircraft slowly began to move, the engines building to a steady hum, the world outside shifting as the ground gave way to motion, there was a quiet truth left behind in that terminal, one that would not be spoken over any loudspeaker, one that would not appear in any report, but one that remained just the same, steady and undeniable. That power is not proven by who acts first, but by who understands last, and by then, it is already too late.